All right, good morning, everyone. Good to see everybody here for class this morning. If you haven't been with us this weekend, we've been having a meeting here with Mike Wilson. He's from Santa Clara, California. He's been preaching a while now, and he's kind of has done a lot of studies on how we got the Bible, and started with him collecting antique Bibles, and then kind of fueled his interest from there, and has even written a book on it, and has been presenting this material kind of all over the country. And so this is I guess we're up to lesson 4 now on this, but if you want to see the other material he has presented for us throughout the week, you can check out our YouTube channel, and all those videos will be uploaded there. Pleasant Valley Church of Christ, Wichita. If you type that in, it'll pop right up. But yeah, anyways, we'll continue with our fourth lesson in the series, the Bible in the Middle Ages, and looking forward to the rest of the series. And I'll also mention that it will conclude at 5 p.m. tonight, so we'll be meeting here at the building, no small groups or anything like that. We'll be back here at the building at 5 p.m. to hear his final lesson as well. So let's go ahead and start with a word of prayer, and then we'll hand it over to Mike. Father in heaven, thank you for this day, and for this chance to be able to learn about your word, and just the care that went into to preserving your word. And we know that, and as has been presented to us, that the Bible didn't come into existence in a conflict-free zone, but had every reason to be destroyed and to not make it to modern times where we are today. But we know that it was your providence behind that word, and preserving it and entrusting it to faithful individuals such as prophets and apostles and unknown scribes that faithfully were guarding this word that was entrusted to them. And so we thank you so much for your provision, so that we can know you and know your Son, and know the gospel, that we can be saved and experience everlasting life with you. And so we're thankful as well for Mike's efforts. We know that this was something that material that he didn't just stumble upon, but that required a lot of effort, a lot of hours, and are just grateful for his contribution, and pray that you be with him presenting this material, and be with us as listeners. And it's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
One of the questions that inevitably comes up when you're dealing with this subject is you've got this huge time lag between the 5th century AD and the 15th or 16th century AD. You've got about 1,000 years of what are often called the Middle Ages, medieval period. And what was going on with the Bible during that period? Related question that sometimes we get is, did the Catholic Church somehow change this message in a wholesale way? Did they take the Bible and fundamentally change the message of the Bible during this period? And the short answer is no, they didn't change it. They did suppress it in regard to the common people of the time, but they did not change it. For starters, at the very beginning of the Middle Ages, you have manuscripts floating around everywhere, and we have manuscripts whereby we can reconstruct essentially the entire Bible that predate the Roman Catholic Church. And so I do believe that the word that Sam used in the prayer about God's providence aptly describes the care and concern that preserved the Bible during this period. I have a love-hate relationship with the Middle Ages. To me, it's a period of castles, cathedrals, cobblestone streets, damsels in distress, knights in shining armor, fairy tale world. And in some ways, whenever I travel over to Europe with my wife, who is German, she's over there right now, we will stop at the Hauptbahnhof in Germany, which is the main train station of a town, and these old towns are in concentric circles, and the middle circle is the oldest part of the town, and you got the second oldest part of the town, and then the third oldest, and so on. So it's like concentric circles working outward. But that inner circle often has this church building, idyllic, beautiful, maybe a cathedral, and old cobblestone streets and some really old medieval period buildings alongside modern fashion boutiques and shops and all this kind of stuff. Really fun to stumble on those kinds of an area, those areas, but nonetheless, that fairy tale mythology or imagination that often we conjure up when we think about the Middle Ages. It was also a period of great brutality and cancer culture on steroids. If we think we have it bad with cancer or cancel culture now, it's cancel culture on steroids. So you might think, I wish we could go back to the good old days of a Christian society in which everybody is a professed Christian and everybody even belongs to the same church. And everybody subscribes to the same basic truths, and atheists are not tolerated. Well, that's the society of the Middle Ages, but it was not a utopia by any stretch of the imagination. But even so, during this period, God is preserving the message of His Word. And so we're going to be looking at that a little bit this morning. And, okay. Just kind of going back to the heels of where we left off yesterday with Bart Ehrman, some of his books, Text of the New Testament, Misquoting Jesus Forged. We gave this quote at the end of the second lesson yesterday where he admits that his mentor, Bruce Metzger, and he were on the same page, even though his mentor was a believer and he's an unbeliever. If he and I were put in a room and asked to hammer out a consensus statement on what we think the original text of the New Testament probably looked like, there would be very few points of disagreement, maybe 1 or 2 dozen places out of many thousands. And there are a few meaningful and viable instances of textual variants where you have to really think through what the text really would be. The end of Mark 16 is one, beginning of John 8 is another, the confession of the Ethiopian eunuch in Acts 8 is another one. But really and truly, the typical manuscript variation is something more like this. Simeon Petros or Simon Petros. Simon Peter or Simeon Peter in 2 Peter 1:1. And this one's a toss-up because they're good manuscripts that contain one or the other. But does it amount to a hill of beans? No. You have spelling differences. And even in medieval England, John Wycliffe's name is spelled a number of different ways. William Tyndale's name is spelled a number of different ways. You didn't have uniform spelling all the time. And so with a difference like this, it's, again, a difference without a whole lot of distinction. We've talked about material evidence in manuscripts. As we enter the end of the antiquity period, you have all these hundreds of manuscripts from the first several centuries before the medieval period really kicks off. And there are little clues in these ancient Christian artifacts that we call the early manuscripts. There are pinpricks, for instance, that you can sometimes see where they would draw lines. They would use the pinpricks to draw lines to justify the margins or to have neat columns for the text. You would have line and page count in certain instances. One of the statements that Bart Ehrman made that I quoted yesterday is that these manuscripts were written by a bunch of amateurs. In some cases, that's true. In most cases, they were familiar with writing and pumping out documentary materials. They may not have been professional scribes in every instance, but in some cases they were professional scribes. And here's a case in point where you have the Codex Claromontanus from the 5th or 6th century, and you have a column on the left that says Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy in the same order that we would recognize in our Bibles. And then you have a number in the right column. And what that number represents is line count. Genesis, 4,500 lines. Exodus, 3,700 lines. And why would that be there, do you suppose? You're paying a scribe for so much output, and he's adding it all up. And so many of these manuscripts were written by professional scribes, and here's an instance where it's actually added up. And so you think about that. These writing materials themselves were not cheap. Think of how many thousands and thousands of animals had to be slaughtered to get the manuscripts out. But also, if you're paying a professional scribe on top of that, this is not cheap. And yet, Christians paid the price. We talked about little marginal comments, such as this one in the Codex Vaticanus, Fool and Knave, can't you leave the old reading alone, not alter it? So they had this built-in respect for biblical authority. My favorite instance comes from the Middle Ages, a manuscript where they had this beautiful manuscript and then discovered that they missed a word. And what do you do about that? Do you destroy the whole manuscript? Or do you have an animal and a man on the right column bring in the word and put it where another man is pointing? And that's exactly what they do. I love that. But you can't miss a word, even if you made a botch, when you made the original manuscript. So there's this built-in respect for biblical authority. No additions, no deletions, no alterations, no tampering. Tendency to be careful and respectful of the text with a primary respect or primary focus on the sacredness of the text itself without drawing attention to peripheral issues. Now, what I would say is, I have all these facsimiles in copies of manuscripts that date from the medieval period. You can't really buy a lot of those because they're very expensive, and I have a limited budget. So I bought a lot of facsimiles and copies, and if I were to bring those out and just lay out 20 tables where we have stuff from the beginning to the end and how we got the Bible, that medieval few tables would be one of the neatest ones to look at, because these manuscripts are colorful, they're artistic, they have all kinds of drawings and colors, and a lot of painstaking effort went into that. But, and you look back at the manuscripts from the first few centuries, and you may not know quite what to look for, and they look kind of plain and simple and unvarnished. And it's kind of like the difference between stepping into an assembly of Christians in a plain meeting place in the first few centuries that doesn't have all the elaborate embellishments and the stained glass windows and the icons and so on, versus stepping into a medieval cathedral. And I liken the difference to that, because as you get into the Middle Ages, everything gets embellished, and it really becomes more of a style versus substance thing rather than a substance versus style thing. You lose some of the substance and you're more into the elaborate external style. And so in the earliest manuscripts, it's not style over substance, but as you get into the Middle Ages, you see more elaborate stuff, and we can reconstruct the text with near 100% accuracy just based on the manuscripts that come before the Middle Ages. So the Catholic Church didn't mess with the text. They did suppress it, but they didn't mess with it. And in fact, we do owe a certain debt of gratitude to all those scribes, thousands of scribes that continued to copy the text down through the ages. But you have one additional quality control measure that's often not talked about. Communal reading events were widespread in the Roman Empire. And this really didn't occur to me till a couple of years ago. And did a little bit of reading and research on it. One of the most popular entertainment venues in the Roman Empire was people would get together and listen to texts being read. Poetry, it may be an ancient work of literature or whatnot. And again, that was also common in the synagogues and in the churches of the early few centuries of the church. But with regard to the biblical text, it was not fluid. It was not going every which direction century after century after century, even in a society where the literacy rates were not as high as they would be in modern America. Some have estimated that in the Roman Empire you might have 15% literacy rate, something like that. Although I think you could make a case that the literacy rates were much higher than that, or a little bit higher at least. You have inscriptions that were all part of the Roman Empire world, and people could read those inscriptions in many cases. But here's a case in point that really nails this. Jerome produced a new version of the Latin. We call it the Latin Vulgate, the common Latin version, at the end of the 4th century. And it replaced the old Latin versions that had been read in places like North Africa and Italy and so on. And Augustine, famous theologian, wrote a letter to Jerome saying that when one word differed in the Latin of what we would call Jonah 4 verse 6, one word differed from what members had been hearing read for generations, the whole congregation went into an uproar. It would be like, you're used to reading the King James Version all your life, and all of a sudden comes the New American Standard Version, and you got more than one word different. The whole congregation was in a ruckus because of one word difference. Here are people that have commonly had the word read to them, and that's how they internalize the Word of God. They don't have individual copies that they engage with day after day. They hear it read week after week after week in church, and they know the text so well that when one word differs, you've got a riot on your hands. In that kind of environment, do you think the Roman Catholic Church could have messed with this wholesale century after century after century? There's no way. That's one more little piece of evidence that shows the text is not fluid. It's fixed, and it's understood, and people know it really, really well. We talked about this concept yesterday, the decentralization of the text. Once you have copies and copies and copies going every which way, that's a guarantee that no central agency or bureaucracy could control or alter the message, and they did not control or alter the message. They suppressed it, but they did not control it. The revealed word was primary, not the church as a validating institution, at least at the beginning of that period, but that changes. That changes. In 476, Odoacer and the German hordes invade Italy and take down Rome, destroy it in many respects, and or take over at least. And the Middle Ages begin. And so you have this completely different period that begins, and I love it and hate it at the same time. I've been to the Middle Ages Museum in Paris, France. It's one of my favorite museums in the whole world. It's not one that people commonly go to or talk about. Been to the Loire Valley in France, where you have, again, a number of cathedrals and castles and beautiful places to visit, and just love the manuscripts of that period. And This is the Cologne Cathedral, not far from where my wife Andrea grew up. It is a monstrosity, gigantic, and you enter Cologne, or we do, on the central train station, and that's the only thing you see. I mean, I can't even, this picture doesn't even do it justice. It's gigantic, and you walk into that thing, and you're looking up, and you can barely see the ceiling. It's so high. It's amazing. Walking up to the front door or looking at the stained glass windows. We're no longer in the era of simple undenominational Christianity without elaborate trappings on the externals. You've entered a period, this is Notre Dame de Paris before it burned. And so traveled around, seen some of these places. This is Loire Valley near Amboise, France. And I'm wearing my Golden State Warriors cap. I'm next to I've got my warrior mode going on there against the night in shining armor. This is Rothenburg in Germany. It's a walled city that preserves a lot of the medieval charm. You have these walls all around the town. And it was kind of rebuilt to some degree after World War II. But they have this medieval crime museum. Again, against the backdrop of all the charm of the Middle Ages, you have this medieval crime museum and instruments of torture, one after another, after another. So if you ever think, I'd like to go back to that fairy tale world, you have to include this in the formula. And just a lot of things in which, a lot of instruments that were guaranteed to make people cooperate and conform to the prevailing agendas and narratives of society, including the Roman Catholic faith. There were heretics. Yes, there were heretics. We read about the Bogomils, the Waldensians, the Albigensians or Cathars. We read about the Lollards in England and Hussites in the Czech Republic or Bohemia. But there's an old picture of Andrea, my wife, and you could tell that she's writhing in pain and she's being incarcerated. But wouldn't want to go down into the dunk and be tortured in that way or sit on that nice comfortable chair. What I'm trying to tell you is this is not a utopia by any stretch of the imagination. It was a brutal world in which to live. Brutal. And if you didn't conform to the powers that be, you were paying a potentially dear price, and it might be your life. And there were a number of people that were incarcerated, arrested, and even burned at the stake for not conforming in various ways. And so there were heresies. And some of those heresies, some of those heretics latched on to ideas. If they could get a hold of a Bible, and if they could read the Bible they got a hold of, they would latch on to ideas that were, in many cases, close to what you and I hold near and dear. But it wasn't always easy for them. And more often than not, they lived in a world that was dominated by Roman Catholicism. The Dark Ages was truly one of biblical illiteracy. And one could say that people had access to the Bible in passion plays, Franciscan and Dominican friars that would come around, preach, and be celebrities, or the stained glass windows, or other versions of devotions that served the purpose of upholding the Roman Catholic hierarchy. But all of this served the purpose of underpinning proper attention to the liturgy or the Roman Catholic hierarchy. The whole Bible was not in the picture. And certainly individual engagement with the Bible was not in the picture. You have books of hours like this one. You have beautiful texts that sometimes wealthy people own, such as this Furtmeyer Bible from Germany in the late 1400s. Beautiful to look at. I've got a replica. It's stunning, beautifully artistically designed. There were a lot of apocalypse books of Revelation that were depicted in pictures. You have a lot of gospel books of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, some psalters, and so on. Not necessarily owned by the common people, but owned by wealthier people. And you have a lot of scribes replicating the text one after another. But again, you don't have these simple, unvarnished manuscripts. You have fancy ones now. The High Middle Ages, and you got these beautiful books to look at. But you, again, lose some of the substance, and it becomes more of a stylistic thing. This goes back to the Gothic translation by Wolfila, Little Wolf, a guy that translated the Bible into Gothic for the Germanic peoples up in northern Europe. And the Codex Amiatinus, that is a gospel book, 4 gospels, and beautiful to look at, with supposedly Ezra the scribe with a surprisingly modern cabinet that has different sections of the Bible in the cabinet. One more thing, to counter people that will say the Roman Catholic Church has messed with the Bible during this period. You have this guy Eusebius, beginning of the 4th century, and he was a church historian. He wrote a very famous ecclesiastical history, church history, in the early 4th century. And it's largely due to Eusebius that we know what happens to the apostles and what happens in those first 3 centuries of Christianity, because he preserves it and records it, and for the most part does a pretty good job telling us what happened, where things went, and so on. But the other service that he rendered to the world was he produced this way of cross-referencing the 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. This is before the day of chapters and verses. And how could you compare what Mark 4 says with Matthew 13, with Luke 8, for instance, parable of the sower that's in all 3 of those accounts, before you even have chapter and verse divisions? Well, he divides all 4 Gospels into sections. And you have a comparison of those sections, 10 canon tables that would be at the beginning of these gospel books in the Middle Ages. But this begins in the early 4th century, just beginning of the 300s. Table 1 would include episodes in all 4 Gospels. So the feeding of the 5,000 is in all 4 Gospels. The resurrection of Christ is in all 4 Gospels. And he would peg these different, and give them numbers, different sections. Tables 2 through 9 would be episodes common to 2 or 3 Gospels. Maybe it's in Matthew and Mark. Maybe it's in Mark and Luke, or Luke and John, or what. Table 10 is episodes unique to 1 Gospel. And so this was a way of cross-referencing parallel accounts prior to modern chapter and verse divisions. And when you look at these medieval gospel books, it's quite beautiful. This is the Irish Book of Kells. It dates from about AD 800. And this is what a typical Eusebian canon table would look like at the beginning. Sometimes the artist would elaborate with some kind of halfway funny pictures. But these were the Eusebian tables. And then you actually open the text to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and you would have in the margins the numbers that would correspond to these tables. So one could identify what Matthew talked about with what Mark talked about with what Luke talked about, and so on. And even when you get into the early 1500s, I have a printed Latin text that has the same canon tables. And but here's the thing. Here's the Codex Sinaiticus. It has the Eusebian, and it dates from the 4th century. It doesn't have the tables at the beginning. If they were there originally, they've been lost. But in the margins, even in the Codex Sinaiticus in the 4th century, you already have the numbers in the margins. And they continue on till the 1500s. Do you understand what I'm saying? That if anyone suggests that the Roman Catholic Church just totally changed, or any other entity, totally changed the gospel records, and that the Jesus that we see in those records at the end of the Middle Ages is different from the Jesus that you see at the beginning of the Middle Ages, that's impossible, because these Eusebian canon tables earmark every paragraph of the Gospels throughout this whole period. And so you have, even in the printed text that I have in the 1500s, the Eusebian canon numbers for Matthew 1. Chapter and verse divisions didn't come till later. Stephen Langton is generally credited for the chapter divisions. He died in 1228. He was the Archbishop of Canterbury, and he's also largely credited for the Magna Carta, pretty famous document. And credit for the verse divisions goes to Robert Estienne, a Frenchman whose Latin name was Robertus Stephanus, 1551. The first English edition to incorporate that was the Geneva Bible, New Testament 1557, the entire Bible 1560. Prior to that, someone like William Tyndale will mention, Matthew 5a, Matthew 5b, Matthew 5c, and they would talk about paragraphs in chapters versus the verses. They didn't have verses till in a full English Bible till 1560. Okay, so talk a little bit about John Wycliffe, who's this Catholic clergyman in the 1300s. And you have all this hunger, pent-up hunger for the Bible, because people knew they were not engaging in the Bible. One exercise that I give to students when I talk about this in a class situation is, would you rather have a cathedral, a passion play, an artistic rendering of a biblical scene, a page from a medieval book of hours, and a Franciscan monk, and your exposure to the Bible comes through all of that, or would you rather own a copy of the Bible for yourself? Well, they wanted the Bible. They had all those other things, but they wanted their own personal Bible. And they were not getting it. And so what ends up happening is Wycliffe wants to put the Bible into the hands of the common person. And so in the 1380s, they launched this project, and he leads a translation team that produces the Bible around 1380 or so. And there's a second edition in the 1390s. And they were relatively simple, written with obvious care, written on vellum to last, free from additional matter. And about 20 manuscripts of the entire Bible have survived from that period, almost 90 of the entire New Testament, 250 including all individual books of the New Testament. Sometimes people would own only a copy of an individual book. I've got a copy of the Gospel of John, or I've got a copy of Acts, or whatever. And handwritten, every one of them. This is before the printing press. And this is what some of the Bibles look like. They were elaborated on with artistic renderings. But the Catholics didn't like this project so much. Henry Knighton, Catholic chronicler, said Christ gave his gospel to the clergy and the learned doctors of the church so that they might give it to the laity and to weaker persons according to the message of the season and personal need. But this master John Wycliffe translated the gospel from Latin into English, the Angle, not the angel language. And Wycliffe, by thus translating the Bible, made it the property of the masses and common to all, and more open to the laity, even to women who were able to read. Can you imagine that? And so the pearl of the gospel is thrown before swine and trodden underfoot, and what is meant to be the treasure both of clergy and laity has now become a joke of both. That's what you call an elitist bias. of the elites not wanting commoners to have the privilege of engaging with this themselves. And it's kind of a shame, but if anyone tells you that the Roman Catholic Church didn't try to suppress this, think again. Even though he challenged the church, John Wycliffe died a Catholic. But 44 years after his death, his body was exhumed, burned, and the ashes were scattered over the river Swift. So we're done with that problem, right? Solved. Wrong. What began with Wycliffe spread to Eastern Europe. Jan Hus, in what is the modern Czech Republic near Prague, reads Wycliffe over and again and begins to launch a reform movement of his own. And they have to stamp that out, and he's persecuted and killed. But in England, the work of John Wycliffe launches kind of a movement of its own. And you have these people that were called Lollards. And Lollards, the word Lollard probably means ranter. It's a derogatory word. They thought of themselves as true Christians, over and against Roman Catholicism, even though they sometimes attended the regular masses of the Catholic Church. But they met in the evening at night, late at night, in these assemblies called conventicles. And what they would do late into the evening, after the workday was over, is they would take these translations of the Bible from the Latin, not the original Greek and Hebrew, but from the Latin that Wycliffe had led, and they would memorize Scripture in English. And as a consequence of that, they came to all these different conclusions when they were memorizing Scripture in English, which they could understand as opposed to the Latin. Many of them came to the conclusion that we ought not to have images in church. We don't need these expensive, elaborate cathedrals or church buildings. We shouldn't have holy days. We don't need confession to a priest. We shouldn't have allegiance to the Pope. There shouldn't be any prayers for the dead. Some of them came to the conclusion there shouldn't be any infant baptism and no Latin Mass. Let's keep it in English so we can understand. And some of them even came to the conclusion we should not only not have Latin music with organs, but we shouldn't even have the organs. We should just sing. Bishop Arundel had an examination of a Lollard named William Thorpe in 1407. And he was interrogating him. And he said, do you think we should have musical instruments in church? And this is in John Fox's Acts and Monuments, that shortened form we would call the Fox's Book of Martyrs. You probably maybe heard of that. But he was interrogating William Thorpe, and do you think we should have instrumental music in church? And William Thorpe said no. Why not? And he used an argument I would never think to use, but he said, when Jesus went into the house of Jairus to heal that little girl, he put out the minstrels. So that was his argument. He put out the minstrels, and we need to put out this nonsense out of the cathedrals and the churches. But, even though I wouldn't use that argument, it's amazing to me that just reading the Bible, what conclusions that people can sometimes come to. It's amazing when they don't have to have a filtered version of the Bible presented by the powers that be, but can engage with it themselves. It's amazing what conclusions people can come to. These folks had a tremendous influence over William Tyndale in the early 15th centuries. They cast a long shadow. he thought like one of us in many respects. I'll get into that in the next hour. Our time is almost up. I think we go to about 10:15. Is that? What's that? 15 after. Okay, so we're almost over. But one thing that changed the whole equation here is what happened in Mainz, Germany. Again, not far from where my wife grew up. You have this movable type printing device that is launched, and you have in the mid 1400s, the first book that comes off the printing presses is the Latin Vulgate, Jerome's Latin Vulgate Bible. And the dream that Johann Gutenberg had in printing the Bible and in launching this printing press project, God suffers in the multitude of souls whom his word cannot reach. Religious truth is imprisoned in a small number of manuscript books which confine instead of spreading the public treasure. Let us break the seal which seals up holy things and give wings to truth, in order that she might go and win every soul that comes into the world by her word, no longer written at great expense by a palsied hand, but multiplied like the wind by an untiring machine. Yes, it is a press, certainly, but a press from which shall soon flow in inexhaustible streams the most abundant and marvelous liquor that has ever flowed to relieve the thirst of men. Through it, God will spread his word. A spring of pure truth shall flow from it. Like a new star, it shall scatter the darkness of ignorance and cause a light heretofore unknown to shine amongst men. This is a copy of a 1514 Complutensian Bible, which is Latin and Greek, which brings the period of handwritten manuscripts to an end. 2 years later, Erasmus prints a Greek New Testament for the first time, and Luther and Tyndale would use that version of the Greek New Testament to translate the Bible into their native German and English. Erasmus himself was a Catholic, but he challenged the powers that be. He said, I wish that the scriptures were translated into the languages of all people, that they might be read and known not merely by the Scotch and Irish, but even by the Turks and the Saracens. I wish that the husbandman may sing parts of them at his plow, that the weevil may warble them at the shuttle, that the traveler may with their narratives beguile the weariness of the way. Erasmus was too conservative to leave the Roman Catholic Church, and so he defended the Catholics even though he attacked them, sort of. But someone said that Erasmus was he laid the egg that Luther hatched, and he responded that by saying that he would have expected a different kind of bird than Luther. But nonetheless, you had to work outside the system if you were going to be effective long term. So I have this Latin Bible, again, reflective of the printing press, and dates from the early 1500s. Beautiful thing to look at. But people had this pent-up hunger. They just wanted to get back to the Bible. Archbishop Fitzralph of Armagh, who was kind of a precursor to John Wycliffe, said, I used to think that I had penetrated the depths of your truth with the citizens of your heaven until you, the solid truth, shone upon me in your scriptures, scattering the cloud of my error and showing me how I was croaking in the marshes with the toads and frogs. Now I have the Bible. And it sometimes came at a price. If you had lived back then, would you be willing to pay that price? You need to think about that. We'll talk about Martin Luther in the next hour because my time is up right now. So, but I want to say a little bit about Martin Luther and a whole lot about William Tyndale and some others as we look at translating the Bible into English. More difficult than you might think. But during this Middle Ages period, the Roman Catholic Church did not produce the Bible, they suppressed it. The hunger for the Bible in its original context was intense, and it was such a pressure cooker that the cork finally blew. And it was inevitable, but eventually there was no stopping it. And we'll start there in the next hour.